What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in this video I'm going to be going through my top 36 Week 9 running back rankings, also splitting up these running backs into different tiers. If you guys enjoy the rankings video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. I'll also have my wide receivers coming out today. But let's honestly just dive right into it. We have 4 teams on bye. One of those teams is the 49ers, so we will not have the locked-in Christian McCaffrey #1 running back slot this week. We're going to have 4 Tier 1 running backs. It's going to be Saquon Barkley, Austin Eckler, Alvin Kamara, and Breece Hall. With the Giants' kind of quarterback troubles, does seem like they could get Daniel Jones this week, but I still think they're going to rely very heavily on Saquon Barkley. Solid matchup here against the Raiders, who as a team seem to kind of be in shambles at this point. So he's going to be my RB1. We saw a great bounce back from Austin Eckler. Even though the Jets defense is tough overall, they're actually not too rough to go against for opposing fantasy running backs. So good to see there. Alvin Kamara on an absolute tear. Nice matchup against the Bears. And then Breece Hall going up against the Chargers. I expect him to continue to produce at a very, very high level. Now shifting into Tier 2, this is pretty much going to be our mid-tier RB1s to our back-end RB1s. Going to start it off with Raheem Mostert. Hasn't necessarily been putting up insane production with Achane on IR, but he's been fine. I think he's going to have a nice game here, clearly leading this Dolphins backfield, which is a very, very valuable role to have. Then we're going to have Bijan Robinson. I like the Falcons shifting to Taylor Heineke. I think that's going to raise the ceiling of this offense. I think Bijan Robinson is a really nice mid-tier RB1. Next up at running back 7 and running back 8, we actually have 2 guys in the same matchup. So DeAndre Swift at RB7, Tony Pollard at RB8. Both these guys are going to be drawing tough matchups, with Swift going up against the Cowboys defense, Pollard going up against the Eagles defense, but both these guys are very involved. They're going to have solid workloads, even in tough matchups. I still think they're really nice RB1 plays. Then as my RB9, I'm going to have Joe Mixon. Good to see Mixon finally kind of have a breakout game. The usage had been there. He just kind of finally capitalized on a solid fantasy game. After Mixon, I have Josh Jacobs. I'm not feeling great about Josh Jacobs at this point, rest of season, just looking at what's happened here with the Raiders. So obviously they kind of turn over the coaching staff. They're going to, move Jimmy G to the bench. Aiden O'Connell's going to be the starter moving forward. And so I think that's a net negative just in terms of Jimmy G's probably the better quarterback. So they're kind of shifting to the younger option, probably not as solid. So I think the offense is going to suffer. But I also think they're in a spot where maybe they start to get Zamir White more involved, start to, take away this full-on workhorse role from Josh Jacobs. Not saying he's going to lose the RB1 spot, but maybe it becomes more of a committee. And in a bad offense that has already been pretty inefficient on the ground, I don't know if that's going to be great for Josh Jacobs rest of season. So a little weary of him, but I still think he's a back-end RB1. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be Derrick Henry. Solid game last week. I think Will Levis is intriguing moving forward, going up against the Steelers tonight on Thursday Night Football. Now looking at Tier 3, a pretty small tier here. We're going to go Isaiah Pacheco, Kenneth Walker, and Jonathan Taylor. I feel like these are all solid running back plays, but they each kind of have their own question marks. For Pacheco, I just think his weekly ceiling is a little bit capped. He's going to have a decent workload on the ground, but he's not locked into this massive workload every single week. Assuming the Chiefs offense is rolling, he should give you some efficient production. He's probably not going to be overly involved in the receiving game. We kind of saw the lack of floor last week when they struggled against the Broncos, but I still have him as my RB12, so an RB1. Then we have Kenneth Walker. And if I knew that Kenneth Walker would be locked into his workload prior to last week, then he would be much higher. He'd honestly probably be like a mid-tier RB1. But we saw him missing practices with a calf injury leading up to the Week 8 game. He actually got out-snapped and ran fewer routes than Zach Charbonnet. Zach Charbonnet looked impressive. So I think there's, still a chance here that this is a decent split between Walker and Charbonnet as Walker works back to 100%. So that's why I'm a little weary of him this week. Kind of a similar situation to Jonathan Taylor, where JT and Zach Moss seem to be locked into a very solid split. I feel like Kenneth Walker could be in a similar situation with Zach Charbonnet. Now moving into Tier 4, these are going to be like your mid-tier RB2s to your back-end RB2s. Going to start it off with Rachaad White. I feel like Rachaad White is the clear guy to kind of lead this tier. He's going to have a solid workload. The efficiency may not always be there, but if he can continue his receiving production that we've seen over the last 2 weeks, that will be a great sign for him moving forward. Then we're going to have James Cook. Don't feel great having James Cook as the running back 16, but I kind of feel like it's a fair ranking. The lack of receiving usage has been a little bit disappointing, but I don't think that's like a thing that's locked in rest of season. He could end up getting more involved as a pass catcher. He's going to have a fine workload on the ground and then attached to one of the best offenses in the NFL. Behind Cook, we have Gus Edwards, who is coming off a massive 3-touchdown game. I feel like some people may kind of go overboard on Gus Edwards after 1 or 2 big games. His usage has pretty much stayed the same. He's going to have a nice workload on the ground. He's not going to be too involved as a pass catcher, but attached to this Ravens run offense, it's a fine workload to have. A decent RB2, especially with the bye weeks, a mid-tier RB2 for me here. Then we have Ramondre Stevenson, kind of locked into somewhat of a committee with Ezekiel Elliott, but he is the clear better option in that committee. The Washington defense has kind of been tough, but I don't think they're going to be super formidable after the moves they made at the trade deadline. Next is going to be Chuba Hubbard, and he pretty much took over this Panthers backfield. Miles Sanders was really not involved. He actually got out-touched by Blackshear, which is, pretty rough if you do roster Miles Sanders. So assuming Chuba holds on to that role, I think he's a nice mid-tier RB2. Behind Chuba, we're going to have Zach Moss. And if they just continue to split this backfield 50-50 with JT and Zach Moss, I feel like you just got to fire him up. So, Zach Moss here, going to be a mid-tier RB2 for me this week. There's always the risk that they just, kind of continue to pivot more and more towards Jonathan Taylor. But through 3 games, it hasn't happened yet. So I think he's a fine option. And then the last 2 guys in this tier, Aaron Jones, Brian Robinson, both these guys are kind of in somewhat gross splits. For Aaron Jones, it just seems like his health has kind of limited his workload. You're hoping he improves on what we saw last week. And then for Brian Robinson, we kind of know what we're getting out of him. He's going to have a decent workload on the ground, not super involved as a pass catcher. And also, he's a guy who can kind of get hurt when they're in a trailing game script because then they pivot to the better pass catcher in Antonio Gibson. So I think he's a fine back-end RB2. And then shifting into a pretty small tier 5, we're going to go Darrell Henderson, Dameon Pierce, Alexander Madison. This is pretty much the tier featuring like leaders of somewhat gross backfields with committees. So you have Henderson here, but he's going to be splitting with Royce Freeman. You have Dameon Pierce, who's pretty much splitting 50-50 with Devin Singletary, but Pierce is getting the goal line work. And then you have Alexander Madison splitting with Cam Akers. So, fringe RB2s for those guys. Then a pretty large tier 6 here is going to close it out. These are pretty much all players in ambiguous backfields, potentially leading, but it's up in the air, or like the RB2s in certain backfields. So we're going to start it off with back-to-back Browns running backs, Kareem Hunt, Jerome Ford. Tough to put these guys in a higher tier because this has turned into a 3-man committee with Pierre Strong. I do think Hunt and Ford are both much better options than Pierre Strong at this point. Then we're going to have Amari DiMercado. Now, in terms of his usage, he probably, has an argument to be higher. He does draw a tough matchup here against the Browns, and we did see him lose out on work from Week 7 to Week 8. Week 7, he was the full-on workhorse. Week 8, he was giving up receiving opportunities to Keontae Ingram. Also, we don't know what's going to be happening here with this Cardinals offense. No Dobbs. Are they going to go with Tune? How's the offense going to operate? So that's why he's more of like a high-end RB3 for me. Then we're going to have Zach Charbonnet. Talked about Kenneth Walker and how Charbonnet played a pretty solid role in Week 8. We'll see if he's able to replicate that here in Week 9. I do think the Seahawks like him. They obviously spent solid draft capital on him, so it wouldn't be shocking to me if he kind of continued to expand on his role. Then we're going to have the back-to-back Steelers running backs. These guys pretty much every week are locked in as like mid to back end RB3s. So Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, back-to-back. Tough matchup here against the Titans. Neither guy has really been a great option for fantasy. Behind those two, we're going to have Devin Singletary. Mentioned how he's in like the 50-50 split with Dameon Pierce. He's just not in there on the goal line, which is why I have him a tier below Dameon Pierce. Also mentioned Royce Freeman with Darrell Henderson. He's their RB2, but it's a pretty close split between those two guys. Then we've got A.J. Dillon. If Aaron Jones isn't able to expand on his workload, then we're probably looking at a 50-50 split like we've seen over the past couple of weeks. Got Roschon Johnson. The Bears shifted to a 3-headed committee with Roschon Johnson, Deonta Foreman, and Darrington Evans. If I had to pick one of those guys, I would go with Roschon just because he led the team in routes run and in snaps in Week 8. And that was him coming off of missing 2 games with a concussion. So I think he has the opportunity to potentially expand on his role, but I wouldn't feel great about it. No Justin Fields again, and then a tough matchup here against the Saints. And then we're going to wrap it up with Tyler Algier. He'll have a solid number of carries on the ground, but not someone you can have really any sort of confidence firing up into your lineup. Very, very low weekly floor if he doesn't get into the end zone, because he's not going to be catching passes for you. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 36 running backs. Hopefully this video helped you guys go out, set your fantasy lineups. Like I said at the top, wide receivers will be out today also, so go ahead and take a look at those. Thank you all for stopping by. I will see you in the next one.